Black soldiers had been largely purged from the military during the mass downsizing that followed the end of the Great War. By 1940, there were only 4,179 black soldiers in the Army and 5 black officers, 3 of them chaplains, and the remaining 2 sharing the same name, Benjamin O. Davis. The elder would soon become the nation's first black general, an honor accompanied only by the nagging imputation among African Americans that it was an award for an Uncle Tom. The younger Davis would go on to become a commander of the famed Tuskegee Airmen. Even before the Revolutionary War, when runaway slave Crispus Attucks became the first American to die in the Boston Massacre in March of 1770. African Americans looked upon their service to their country with pride, hoping loyalty and service would advance the case for better treatment of the race. This war was no different. The nation's leading civil rights organization, the NAACP, had been fighting for years to ensure a fair place and equitable treatment for black soldiers in all branches of the military. So, in late summer 1940, when Congress began debating one of the most sweeping facets of Roosevelt's war plan, the nation's first peacetime draft bill, black leaders saw a prime opportunity to influence the agenda. It was an election year, and the black vote would wield clout, like never before. The first battle was waged over the insertion of a clause guaranteeing equal rights to all soldiers, something war planners opposed. Their policy for a future war envisioned a limited role for Negro recruits, seeing a 10% quota in line with the black percentage of the population. They were to be assigned almost exclusively to segregated labor and service units, just as they had been in the last war. Military planners had long believed Negroes to be intellectually and physically inferior to white soldiers. How that perception developed is a lesson in what happens when racism meets pseudoscience, and add to that the selective memories of white officers who led black soldiers in the First World War. And the result was a policy of discrimination that penalized black recruits before they saw their first day of boot camp. And the attitude toward the Negro is perhaps best summed up in an influential 1925 Army War College study that deemed African Americans unfit for combat and helped shape the War Department's treatment of the black soldier. The Negro is profoundly superstitious. He is by nature subservient and naturally believes himself inferior to the white. He is jolly, tractable, lively, and docile by nature, but through real or supposed harsh or unjust treatment may become sullen and stubborn. He has not the physical courage of the white. He simply cannot control himself in fear of some danger in the degree that the white man can. His psychological is such that he is willing to accept hard labor and for this reason can be employed in labor troops or other non-combatant branches. The Negro is unmoral. He simply does not see certain things as wrong. The Negro is one of the most secretive in the world, while the Negro undoubtedly has a state of mind bordering on resentment against the white. This feeling is numbed by his easygoing nature. The Negro's sense of importance will make them more and more of a problem, and racial troubles may be expected to increase. These findings would be repeated over the years in War College reports, training materials, and other documents. An undated War Department memo proclaimed the Negro to be mentally lazy, not retentive, ruled by instinct and emotion rather than by reason, and has to be made to face facts, prone to escapism, likes pomp and ceremony, stubborn to no end, and difficult to assume responsibility. It lacks mechanical sense, has a keen sense of rhythm, which can be put to good advantage in drills of all kinds like marching, gun crew, and so forth. He lies easily and can be easily led and not driven to cowardice, was one of the most persistent stereotypes that followed the black soldier. And regardless of the facts, the concept that African Americans inherently lack bravery dated back to slavery, when Southerners propagated the myth that the few courageous and intelligent Africans had enslaved their countrymen, and the slaves sold in America were only the childlike and cowardly dregs. And this is written by historian and anthropologist Robert B. Edgerton, a British journalist in Alabama during the Civil War. He found something suspicious in the Southern insistence that we are not afraid of our slaves while maintaining curfews, night patrols, and constant vigilance of any stirrings of rebellion. And as time passed, writes Edgerton, evidence that black Americans had fought courageously in America's earlier wars was not only ignored but also systematically denied by influential military officers and government officials. Bad science contributed to the impression that racial differences accounted for lower intelligence among blacks. It is generally recognized that the pure-blood American Negro is inferior to our white population in mental capacity. The War College study concluded, quoting from another source, that found this was due to the smaller size of the black brain, supposedly weighing 35 ounces, as opposed to 45 ounces for the white brain. The Negroes are descended from slaves imported from West Africa. Their characteristics physically were formerly quite uniform and show them to be very low in the scales of human evolution. These findings were reminiscent of an 1869 government report that found the Negro soldiers too animal to have moral courage or endurance. The author, a doctor, also relied on brain size and weight to conclude that the Negro soldier was simple-minded. As to why black soldiers were unfit for jobs as mechanics and specialists, the Army cited their apparent lack of inherent natural mechanical adaptability, and further proof of black inferiority was found in low scores among black recruits in the Army General Classification exam. Despite its nickname, the IQ test, it measured not intelligence but knowledge gleaned from the education and cultural experiences of whites. The Army's reliance on the test came despite the warning of psychologists who designed it that it wasn't meant to gauge pure intelligence, nor was it intended to compare the abilities of man from disparate backgrounds. It was no surprise that, given the odds against them, 84% of black recruits tested in the lowest two categories out of 5, and 65% of whites tested in the top two categories. It was certainly true that literacy in America was a problem. The median education level for all men in 1940 was 8.3 years, and 1 out of 8 was illiterate. Among poor Southern blacks, the situation was far worse, with 4 out of 5 dropping out by the 4th grade. In many parts of the rural South, schools for black children were abysmal, and often there were no options beyond 7th grade. The average per capita expenditure in 18 Southern states to educate a black child was $18 as opposed to $44 for a white child. Yet there was ample proof that many men with little formal education made fine soldiers. In fact, when a nonverbal test was given to black troops, 30% of those formerly in the lowest category moved up, with some scoring in the top level. A highly successful 1943 Army literacy program showed that when given the chance to learn, black recruits excelled. And out of 150,000 soldiers who attained a functional standard of literacy, nearly 87,000 were black. The program also showed no substantial differences in learning ability between the races. Though a slightly greater percentage of blacks completed the program than whites, 80% of the men enrolled graduated and went on to become good soldiers. A review of the program showed, and later in the war, a group of Negro riflemen who volunteered as replacements in white combat units won praise for their performance. And as a group, the men had tested in the second lowest category on the Army test, and yet, in courage, coolness, dependability, and pride, they are on par with any white troops. And one commander said, he went even further, saying they fought with a fierce desire to meet with and kill the enemy, the equal of which I have never witnessed in white troops. War Secretary Henry L. Stimson admitted that the Army adopted tough literacy requirements to limit the number of black recruits. His insistence that black soldiers couldn't be trusted to fight infuriated African Americans, particularly the black press, which railed against Stimson's "Negro is too dumb to fight" policy. And in the years preceding the outbreak of war, test scores combined with racist studies shaped the attitudes of future officers and policymakers. The test became hazard to effective training, wrote Ulysses S. Lee, an official Army historian and author of the employment of Negro troops. Officers learned they could use the low scores to explain away any problems tied to their leadership, from messy barracks to low morale. And in some cases, officers ignored the specious evidence that blacks were less intelligent and competent and were rewarded with good results. The test is not worth a damn with colored troops, said one anti-aircraft artillery commander. Despite the ratings, I have the best group of soldiers in the Army right here in this regiment. Another factor the Army considered in its recommendations concerning black soldiers was their performance in past wars. The 1925 War College study wasn't alone in demeaning this record, emphasizing that when good service occurred, it came under the command of whites. In fact, black soldiers had a proud legacy of service to their country. Nearly 5,000 black soldiers, slave and free, served in George Washington's army, including 3 who crossed the Delaware with him in 1776. A number of black units fought with distinction, including a 226-man regiment from Rhode Island that held off an attack by 1,500 Hessians. That unit was commanded by a white colonel, but another unit led by a black colonel, the so-called Bucks of America, won praise and silk banner from John Hancock. Although Negro troops collected accolades for their service, there was little change. And despite hopes to the contrary, enslaved African Americans remained in bondage. Enough said for now. Stay tuned for part 3.